I'm your host, Nonie Nasir, and today we'll be exploring some thought provoking questions about ESG and its evolving landscape and how it impacts businesses, companies, investors, stakeholders, and even consumers. Joining me today is an expert in the field, Valerie Nielsen, who brings extensive experience across various industries. She has experience on instant response, fraud investigation, board level communication, training, development, third party assurance, data protection. She has created and led risk management for 2 billion and $5 billion business units at Aon, and she was the chief executive, audit executive at Household Finance and director at Pricewaterhouse, and was responsible for business development, service delivery for internal audit, risk and compliance, SOX, etc. Her focus is on operations scaling with growth and product development feasibility. And she also mentors entrepreneurs at Chicago Innovation Institute. We are very honored to have her share her insights and her experience and expertise and shed some light on this evolving landscape of ESG risk and assurance. So, welcome to the show, Valerie.
Noni, it's a pleasure to be here. And after that introduction, I don't know if I can answer a question. Is that me? But no, thank you. It was very, very generous and kind. And I always like talking with you, Noni, because I consider you an expert, and I'm always learning from what you have to say. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Lovely. So let's dive straight right in with regards to ESG and how it's been evolving. It's such a rapid space and pace, as you know it. How do you think ESG risk can impact the traditional risk management and strategies, its frameworks within companies and organizations?
I kind of think about ESG as reinterpreting that overall risk management framework for the 21st century. So if I think about traditionally, there's financial risk, technology, compliance, legal, that whole inventory of risk categories. To me, they've been reinterpreted for culture today with environmental, social, and governance. And then we've connected topics that are important to the globe and across many countries when then we are looking at our social interaction, not just within our companies and our employees, but also our stakeholders and community. Environmental, going not just about pollutants that can come from your manufacturing processes as, say, outputs, but looking at then how you use water, deforestation, even then the impact on extreme weather to climate change. And then on that governance side, I think getting more clarity on what governance is than this sort of very conceptual word, and looking at then executive comps of individuals and teams, and also that reporting, that transparency, and who is validating that that reporting or that data integrity is meaningful. So then when it is reported outside the organization or to investors or to even your lenders, that it actually means something and is connected to the three things that management and really investors are interested in. They're interested in growth and revenue, cost containment, and brand and reputation. So I think ESG is that reinterpreter of that and connecting those three top level strategic outcomes for risk management.
And I think definitely well positioned vis-a-vis the traditional risk management strategies. Do you think there's some adjustment or some customization that is needed to the current risk management framework?
I would say so because industries have different requirements. Some industries are more regulated than others. Of course, energy can be highly regulated depending on your part of the world. financial services in many countries is highly regulated. And of course, you have to break that down between banking and insurance and other types of fintech.
Mhm.
Defense contractors here in the US and I'm sure around the globe. There's more regulation because there's more government oversight in those activities. And then, let alone then on a technology side, if you say you follow certain frameworks like IS or NIST, then you need to, I would say combine, but layer that on. And I think then the danger is with different, unless you kind of bring it together at an enterprise level, is that then I have internal controls or policies and procedures for ESG. I have things for technology risk frameworks. I have something for governmental reporting frameworks. So I think the challenge to particularly the CFO, because this is where many of these responsibilities will lie for reporting, but it's really, again, an enterprise responsibility and accountability, is do you just have, good process? So it shouldn't matter what framework I am using. I should be able to meet those standards. And so I think that's the struggle that we are having now because people may have had, I'd say gaps or may not have had the most sustainable, if I can use another word from the ESG area, but really sustainable processes that have flexibility and or increase in their accuracy when it comes to adding something else to the mix. Um, I will say in the US, it's something that you could historically learn from because it's over a 20-year process now is the Sarbanes-Oxley. I think there's a lot of similarities in that reporting. And now, of course, it came from some very terrible circumstances, of course, from a financial reporting perspective with Enron and several others, but how that had to ramp up in an organization, how it was a change in the culture of accountability, senior leaders and executives to understand much further down in that reporting and financial information cycle on that quality because their accountability was increased. So I think that can be a very good teacher if your organization is trying to layer in ESG to existing processes.
I think because ESG covers so many grounds that you really need to be able to deep dive from the traditional risk management approaches so that it becomes comprehensive in terms of the risk assessment. It's an excellent segue to the next question, really. When we talk about reporting and standards. Currently, we know that there are many various matrices that is utilized and that's been observed. Many different reporting frameworks for ESG performance, for example. How can investors or stakeholders effectively incorporate and compare companies and make informed decisions, especially when they want to look at ESG performance?
Yeah, so I think about I'm an investor group. What's important to me, and that can vary. Some are more focused on the social impacts. Some are more focused on the environmental impacts. I think everyone may have some interest in governance, but it's really on the E and the S. So then you have to, as a company, then determine what in the ESG realm is important to your business and your customers and stakeholders. So what I mean by that is, I'll take the airline industry. Of course, that carbon footprint is pretty much high on the list because of the fuels and different things that they use. So you're probably going to focus on that, and actually, that can be much easier to measure. Now, of course, there's the level three metrics that require much more capabilities and data for compliance. But that is something that a lot of companies have gone to because it's easier to measure. And therefore, then to connect to the financial value and performance so that investors can see how the investment in lowering your carbon footprint and emissions translates into cost containment on your balance sheet. So that's why I think people will do that. So then you have to look at then what frameworks people are using as far as other companies and what will give the best reporting and insights into what you do. There's been some consolidation from ISSB to taking some of those top ones and bringing them together. So I think initially a lot of people had great ideas, and so that's why there was quite a basket of many frameworks out there. But then as they work through them, that's how then we're seeing consolidation. Because just for everything that you're saying, Noni, it's very difficult to have 10 frameworks in which you're doing reporting for investors and stakeholders. Think about what's the one or two areas across that ESG environment that you think is important to report on, and that actually maybe even ask your investors. Ask the street, see what analysts are asking you, particularly if you're a public company. And then I would start there and pilot and go all the way through, because to exactly what you're saying, it's a very big ocean. And so that's why it's very daunting. Focus on a couple areas, get that muscle memory in of that reporting, the data integrity, and also that appreciation of what data integrity is. Because I will also add that I use the example of Sarbanes-Oxley. So in the finance area, we're used to how good is this data? Can I cross-check? Is there another source that I can validate that that's the right number? When we go out to other areas on our manufacturing plants, maybe in marketing, other areas that aren't used to that discipline in data quality and where they've gotten it from, that's why we see those gaps and those challenges in setting up accurate reporting. So that's what I would say is give time to areas who aren't used to that financial reporting rigor to get used to what is required and have that let's say that testing and validation, and teach them the how, the what, the why. So that's what I would say is, if I roll back to choosing the framework, it has to be, first of all, measuring what you need to report on. And then you have to then think about, how do I do this change management and this implementation across probably groups that are not familiar with this kind of rigor.
Wonderful advice, Valerie. We've heard so many. There's Sustainalytics, EcoVardis, ChemScore, FTSE for Good, DJSI, and some companies, especially public listed, they tend to want to go for everything. And as you said, sometimes it's not really necessary, it's not really fit for purpose. And I think that's great advice, to hone into the reporting standards that would meet the kind of investors that you're focused on, or the industry that you're in. So thank you, that's really great advice. The next critical question, I would say, you mentioned about data quality. I think data integrity is one of the key challenges in ESG reporting, right? It's just a myriad of data inputs across the organization, all the way down to the operations. Now, going back to data integrity, should government regulation play a larger role to ensure the company's reporting are accurately disclosing, the right information and data, and reporting on their ESG risks and initiatives? Or should the responsibility mainly lie with industry associations, the ones that we've heard of, like Sustainalytics, DJS, Dow Jones Sustainability Index, or other market driven mechanisms? What's your thoughts on that? There's quite a debate.
Yeah, so I would say both have a role. The issue when it comes to government reporting is it lags behind the needs of the market. And then you can't, if you leave everything to the industry, everyone's going to interpret differently. It doesn't mean that there is any intent to deceive. It's just that they're going to interpret, because companies have variation because they have people in them. So we all have different ideas. So then from an investor perspective, whether you're a private or public company, it makes it hard to compare. So what I would say is that government probably has to speed up the velocity, and maybe industry groups, not say slow down, but have some more common task forces, working groups, than being on either side of the issue. Because when there's something that everyone can understand, it makes that level playing field. And that's what I think helps in reporting. But then the issue is if government is ahead, it's okay. But what I've seen in the US is typically in many of our regulators, we have folks with legal backgrounds or attorneys, and nothing against being an attorney or barrister, but they may not have worked in the industry and been in those roles. So then when you try to operationalize the regulation, there's a lot of unintended consequences. So that's why I'm always a fan of piloting. And here in the US, and I'm sure in many other countries, many of these regulations get posted in what we call the Federal Register for comment. So I think this is where industry groups and companies need to step in and comment and give feedback to the regulator. And many do. Many industry groups across many topics will comment, so that regulator gets that input, because they'll have this probably great legal way of solving the reporting, or solving the gap in the market. However, when you try to do it, it could cost quite a bit of money when, again, the regulator may not have that appreciation. So I think it's, and I say working together more closely, but recognizing there are mechanisms in place for your feedback as a private or public company, or as an industry group, to go back to the government agency that might be putting out those regulations. And then, of course, for us in the US, and again, in many other countries, you have those lobbying efforts then on the legislative branch, because laws come from our Congress. And so that's, I think, very important. Now, the other thing in the US that you have is then you have state law. So we have our federal level and our state law. So those same processes apply in each state, having then a legislation, specific state regulators, and then of course then that executive branch. So I think in our environment, you've got a two-tier system. So you also have to be looking at what states are doing. And so I would say keep an eye on a couple of US states that tend to be leading. And I'm not saying this push, but they may also give inspiration to our federal level regulators. So California is usually out there on many topics, and ESG, it would be one of them. New York is another leading state because of companies headquartered there. The financial markets are in New York City. So those are two places to keep an eye on in the US when you're trying to understand our gauntlet of regulations. And again, so you may need also people at a state level working with regulators, and then also folks at a federal level working with those agencies. So it can be quite complicated, but this is where then there's all those, we have all of our AI and other things to keep on top of these concepts. So a big answer. So there's a place for both, but there has to be better understanding and better cooperation and more feedback from industry to regulators, so that we don't get unintended consequences of well-intended regulations, but actually don't really have the outcomes to protect investors, consumers, and the wider global community.
And I think you nailed it. It's not just in terms of the kind of regulations that they introduce, but also how the companies are actually reporting, vis-a-vis compliance, or how they're disclosing their ESG initiatives. We've heard like DWS, for instance, they've been slapped with hundreds of millions in terms of penalties because uh, they were caught greenwashing on some of their reporting disclosures, and they were over reporting ESG related loans, green loans. Um, so as a consumer, I mean, this basically leads to the next question. For us as consumers, I mean, it matters to us too. We believe, and it's about branding as well. And many companies, they may tout their performing vis-a-vis their targets and initiatives and commitments. But as consumers, for us, how do we and how can we determine if what they're reporting vis-a-vis what they are committing are genuine and or simply greenwashing strategies, so I think this is another tricky question that I thought, we have any thoughts on that.
Yes, there's I've even, and I forget the name. There's even the other side of greenwashing, which is, I say over-reporting or being overconfident in your results, because they're not supported by the data. They're not. It's not as fact-based and data-driven as maybe legal and compliance and risk might hope in an organization. There's also the underreporting for just these same reasons that you might be much further and have really, I say, more results, and they're very sustainable and data supported. But you'd rather, underperform and over deliver for the same reasons. So I think, first of all, when you have these issues, it can be your marketing, your communication folks that are out a little further out in front. And also, you could have other leaders, too, if you're a public company, that maybe aren't as scripted as they should be if they're on analyst calls, right? Because people are going to ask the underlying questions. Things that are extremely important to you, you need to look at the website and see what the reporting they have. And then you could do some just simple research to see what analysts are saying, or others about that organization's results, because there are people that can go deeper. Now, you can't expect every consumer to be so expert, but you have to look at the results. And so I think that's the best way. Lower carbon emissions and by 50% by 2030, maybe, but that means then you probably got to see in their financial statements and disclosures a very high investment that is
Mm.
happening over a multi-year period. And if you don't see that, you have to wonder how that's going to happen. So that's a great goal, but then it doesn't always pan out to what you think. A very great example a couple months ago was Legos. Love Legos. We all grew up with Lego bricks, and so they thought that they could use some sustainable materials than the plastics. And so they made the announcement, and they worked their way through. And as they realized actually it was going to cost more money to do the sustainable materials, and they really couldn't then meet the target, so then they had to change, and so they worked on some other areas of their process, the necessary, that some of those direct materials. Now they got a lot of criticism for that, but also too, I think that's fair to say sometimes you've got the information you have at that point and it's solid, but then as you try to operationalize, you realize maybe I'm really not saving as much and I'm really not making that kind of impact. So that's why I say it goes both ways.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think you have to ask yourself, okay, how lofty are these goals? Is it reasonable? Do they have those milestones in place? Are they self-evaluating? Do they make changes to their strategy and their targets? They might, because as you go, it may not be achievable. So also then you have to see, as an organization, using it as a marketing tool in order to attract consumers, saying, we're sustainable, we do this because it's important to us.
Mm.
So again, then this is where you look at that their underlying information to see if that's really viable, and also what's been their history. Um, if you've been a polluter, it's very hard to make that cultural change in your organization. It can be done, but it costs a lot of time and money, and then that might be sacrificing that growth in revenue, cost containment, and brand image. To take a look at that, but I think the more complicated a program, the more I would be skeptical, because it's just harder to execute. As we talked about before, that we can't do everything. You really need to pilot and test and kind of go a little slow in the beginning to make sure that you're on the right path and that you're measuring the right things.
And if you're looking at oil and gas or petrochemical companies, especially, it gets a lot more expensive because even carbon capture technology, they're at least a couple of 100 million per project. It's a new area. Investments are very high, so great advice to sort of self audit between what their commitments are and the investments that they declare. or they undertake. That's a great advice. My next
But no,
question,
you
Valerie.
make.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you made a really good point about the technology to actually execute these targets. A lot of that is in its infancy, is very nascent.
Mm,
So you may want to do things, but the technology also has to catch up. And just as you talked about for the measurement and execution of that, it's going to take some time. So the goal, it could be well intended, but as just as you've described, that's really very critical to take a look at that. That how realistic is it to do things to execute that? Because can you capture what you need to measure? Wow,
yeah.
you may not be.
Exactly. It's a lot trickier. So that's why now there's another term, Valerie, green blushing. They are like, okay, we have to step back because I think companies are realizing sometimes, the technology hasn't caught up and it takes, a lot longer to be able to realize. So, yeah, with you, definitely with you on that. And when we look at whole reporting and all that, going to my next question revolves surrounding ESG assurance. So independent auditing, verification of a company's sustainability practices. Now, realistically, how effective do you think this assurance processes are, and what does auditors face in terms of challenges when assessing this complex and evolving ESG risks in organizations?
Yeah, so I think this actually goes back to we were talking earlier about regulations and frameworks and oversight. So if I think of other areas, maybe some of our listeners are familiar with service organization control reports. So that's looking at how controls are for one type of report, a SOC 1 report, looking at your controls for financial reporting.
Mhm.
Of course, then the next level, as you well know, Noni, then is that SOC 2, and it's really looking at 5 principles when it comes to your technology. It's applied to many kinds of other services and data centers because you're trying to get some insight to the control objectives that management of that company has developed and the testing so that you have insight to exactly what you've talked about. What's the assurance that that control environment, that procedure environment is working as intended so that the service or product you're getting meets certain standards. So that's probably what we need when it comes to ESG. That if you are an independent consultant or you are from a public accounting firm and that you're coming in to do this kind of assurance, as far as I know, there really isn't a standard. We have standards for external audit that these providers need to follow so that they say that if they're testing certain things, they've done certain steps, and then let alone what's the oversight of these firms in what they deliver. In the US, we have the PCOAB that looks at the accounting firms and their standards and their auditing quality. So I'm going to guess that that's probably where we need to evolve because the people to do that are the people who've been doing the financial statement or the internal audit work. So they would have the skills to do testing, to assess processes and determine our internal controls effective, alone effective, but are they designed? So are they designed well so then that they're effective? So that's probably where we need to go. Now, in the interim, I'm going to bet that if I am looking for some sort of assurance report, and most likely it's because I'm a public company and I need to give assurance to my investors that a third party has come in and said, hey, my processes for reporting are pretty good, and that me as an investor, I can rely on that report I'm getting. I would imagine that firms are going back and relying on using those auditing standards for right now. I'm going to imagine that these auditing standards probably need some kind of supplemental guidance and supplemental standards in order to capture this. Because we have to remember there isn't a long-standing expertise out there in the assurance field when it comes to assessing ESG programs. Last 5 that have really exploded. So you see people transitioning to other roles because they've had good experiences, but being an ESG expert is not no, I don't know who has 30 years experience or so in this area. So I would say we probably need some good, quote, auditing or assurance standards when it comes to doing that level of third party validation and confirmation. Um, so that when there's a report issued, we know what that opinion is determined on, just as we do with regular financial statement reporting, whether it's a qualified opinion or, as we would say in the business, a clean opinion.
So this is to be continued. So we may have a specific customized,
Yep.
internal audit for ESG process in the future. So maybe something like IIA can probably look into to provide some sort of framework and standard
Agreed.
approach.
Agreed.
I think we have one, or we do have probably about another 2 minutes. Just one final question. How can companies effectively incorporate ESG risk and assurance into their business strategy and decision making process? Or should it be, a separate sustainability initiative?
So I'm voting that it should be integrated. Um,
Mhm.
as I might have mentioned, my background is financial services and banking. And so what I saw over my career is when there'd be a new regulation, we ended up creating a department just for that regulation. So then we had all of these compliance departments or capabilities or experts that, just did one particular regulation. And sometimes it's required because it could be very much in depth and very critical, maybe to your business. If you have to do it separate, then it's like a homework assignment. And to me, these are all inputs into your decision making. So, what I always like to say is we have to be able, as experts, when we speak with our executives and senior leaders, we need to be able to say why an ESG, or I'll call it an environmental issue, why it's critical to revenue and growth, cost containment, and brand and reputation. Because those are the three things executives are evaluated on. That's how they get their bonuses. You can say that's not right. They should have a broader view, but that's the reality, and particularly in public companies. That's how the markets go. That's what the analysts are looking for. So, what I would say is, how do you translate these issues to how they are impacting your business? So, the investment, right? So, that could be affecting cost containment. It also affects in the treasury area on your cost of capital for how then you are, or whatever the case may be. And then you have to be able to talk about, okay, if we do this, just as you would with technology investments, right? There's that technical deferred investment. You could have that deferred investment in the ESG space. So you have to be able to say that, okay, this is the financial impact of us doing this or continuing. Let's say we'll use some sort of emissions situation. So you could say our emissions by 5% or 2% is going to cost X million dollars. But then there's going to be a cost savings, and you have to be able to base it on your facts and data. And so that's how you be able to tell the story. So then that can be prioritized or integrated maybe with other investments and other activities to achieve those three key strategic outcomes. So that's what I would say, Nonie.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for sharing all your experience and insights. There's a lot of aha moments just now when you shared a few of your thoughts on ESG and risk and assurance. Um, thank you so much for joining us at the pod in this podcast, our second Level Up ESG podcast.
Well, I've enjoyed the conversation, and when you have to answer questions, it makes you think, "Wow, what am I telling people? What do I know?" So this was a very good exercise for me, and I always enjoy speaking with you, Noni.
Lovely. Well, it's been wonderful half an hour with you. That's all the time we have for today's episode. We hope the audience found this discussion valuable and gained a deeper understanding on ESG risk and insurance. Please do join us next time for another insightful conversation. Until then, stay tuned and stay informed. Thank you, Valerie, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Noni.
I think that was wonderful, Valerie.
I did prepare a little bit. I did surprise myself. I must admit. I was like, "Wow, that sounded intelligent."
Yes.